Imagine being stranded in the vast wilderness with nothing but your instincts to guide you. Now picture that you come from a life of luxury where comfort and wealth have always shielded you from the harsh realities of the world. What happens when a billionaire's son finds himself lost in the woods, far from his father's empire? This is the true story of James Caldwell, a young man accustomed to the finest things in life, who faced the ultimate test of survival. His journey through the wilderness would change him forever, and how he survived will leave you in awe. James Caldwell wasn't your average young man. As the heir to one of the world's most powerful tech empires, his life had always been dictated by the privileges that came with unimaginable wealth. His father, Richard Caldwell, was a self-made billionaire, known not only for his fortune, but for his relentless drive and desire for perfection. Richard's empire spanned across industries, from technology to real estate, and he had made sure his son, James, had everything he could ever need: the best education, the latest gadgets, and an extravagant lifestyle that most could only dream of. But despite this wealth, James had always felt like a pawn in his father's grand plans. Richard wanted James to follow in his footsteps, take over the business one day, and expand his legacy. But James? He had other dreams. He longed for adventure, independence, and to carve out a path that was his own. He often found himself bored and restless within the confines of his family's luxury estate, his life a series of extravagant events and photo ops. He wanted something real, something that didn't come with a price tag or a corporate agenda. One summer afternoon, as the golden rays of sunlight filtered through the trees and the smell of fresh pine filled the air, James convinced his father to let him take a break from the constant spotlight and head to the wilderness for a camping trip, a chance to escape the suffocating world of business meetings and social obligations. Richard, though hesitant, reluctantly agreed, but with one condition: James had to take a guide along for safety. Richard wasn't one to let his son take risks, especially in the wild. So James found himself at the base of a mountain range, standing in front of a small but professional outfitter, a local guide named Ethan Walker, who had spent his entire life in the wilderness. Ethan was the opposite of James in every way: practical, rugged, and calm. Ethan looked like he belonged to the wild, his weathered face and calloused hands telling stories of countless days spent in nature. He greeted James with a firm handshake and a raised eyebrow, clearly skeptical of the spoiled young man who had appeared out of nowhere, ready for an adventure. "You sure you're up for this?" Ethan asked, scanning James' pristine hiking gear. James smiled, eager to prove himself. "More than ready," he said, though deep down he wasn't entirely sure. He'd never really spent more than a few hours outdoors, let alone venture into the unknown for days. They set off that morning, the sun high in the sky, casting long shadows on the trail ahead. The forest around them was a canvas of green, the leaves rustling in the wind as birds called from above. Ethan led the way, his movements purposeful and efficient, while James followed, trying to keep up with the steady pace. He was used to luxury, not the discomfort of a backpack weighing down his shoulders or the reality of long, physically demanding hikes. The first few days went by without incident. James began to enjoy the freedom of the outdoors, the crisp air, the towering trees, the quiet solitude. For the first time in his life, he felt detached from the world that constantly demanded his attention. But as the days wore on, the terrain grew more challenging. The trails became steeper, the air thinner, and the weather more unpredictable. James started to feel the weight of the wilderness, both physically and mentally. The second day in the wilderness marked the beginning of James's realization that the wilderness was no place for someone who had lived in the lap of luxury all his life. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that drained him, though that was evident from the soreness in his legs and the rawness of his blisters. It was the psychological toll, the uncertainty of the world around him. Nature was unforgiving, and every step taken seemed to place him further away from the comfort of his usual life. Ethan, however, moved through the wild with ease. His steps were measured, purposeful, and he carried a knowledge that James didn't have. He knew how to find shelter, forage for food, and track the weather, skills James could only dream of. Ethan spoke little, but was always observant, scanning the trail for potential dangers, while James struggled to keep up, cursing under his breath. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the temperature dropped, they set up camp in a small clearing beside a brook. Ethan built a fire quickly, his hands moving with practiced ease as he arranged logs and kindling. James, meanwhile, tried to start his own fire, fumbling with the matches and wet wood, growing frustrated with his lack of skill. "Let me," Ethan said finally, offering a hand to take over the task. "You'll get it with time, but you need to focus more on your surroundings." James sat back, watching as Ethan worked. He was growing increasingly frustrated, but there was also something else, a feeling he couldn't quite pinpoint. He had grown up in a world where everything was handed to him, where mistakes were easily covered up with money and influence. Here, in the wilderness, there was no room for pride or shortcuts. Every misstep was a setback, every failure was a lesson, and that realization gnawed at him more than he liked. The following days proved to be more grueling. The weather grew unpredictable, and the trails were becoming harder to navigate. James was beginning to realize how unprepared he was for this life. There was no one to call for help when things went wrong, no staff to cook his meals or set up his tent. His muscles ached, and his clothes were damp with sweat and dirt. Ethan seemed to thrive in the discomfort, his body and mind hardened by years spent in the wild. He never complained, never seemed to tire. James, on the other hand, was struggling to push past his limits, wondering if he had made a mistake even embarking on this trip. One morning, after a particularly cold and sleepless night, James found himself at odds with Ethan. The air was crisp, and the sun barely peeked through the dense trees as they began packing up their camp. James was growing more frustrated by the hour, his patience thinning as his muscles screamed for relief. The morning routine felt like another cruel reminder of how alien this life was to him. "I can't do this anymore, Ethan," James muttered, his tone sharp. "This whole trip is a disaster. I can't keep up with you. You're a machine. I don't belong here." Ethan paused, looking at him for a moment, before replying in his calm, measured tone. "The wilderness doesn't care if you belong, James. It's not a test of your worth. It's a test of your will. If you want to survive, you'll have to find that will." James's face flushed with anger, frustration bubbling over. "I don't need this life, okay? My father has everything planned for me. Business meetings, partnerships, investments. I'm set for life. But you're out here, alone. What's the point of this, huh? What's the point of all this hardship?" Ethan's expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of something deeper in his eyes. "The point," he said slowly, "is to find something real. Something that isn't dictated by your father or your money or anything else. The wilderness doesn't care about your name, your family, or your wealth. It cares about what you're made of." James felt a sharp pang of something he hadn't felt before, a mixture of guilt, confusion, and something deeper, perhaps even fear. He had never been forced to question his own motives or his identity. Everything in his life had been paved, smooth, and predictable, but out here, in the wild, it wasn't enough to just be someone's son or heir. He had to be more. As the days wore on, their relationship became increasingly strained. James often found himself questioning Ethan's motives, wondering if the guide took pleasure in his discomfort. Was Ethan mocking him for being weak, or was this just a way of toughening him up? The lines blurred, and James struggled to keep his pride intact while trying to push through the grueling terrain. One afternoon, as they reached the edge of a particularly steep cliff, Ethan suggested they take a different route. "We're near the pass now," he said. "It's a tough climb, but we'll make it." James, exhausted and disoriented, agreed, though his gut told him something was off. The route they were about to take didn't look safe. There were jagged rocks, and the trail seemed to vanish behind a thicket of trees. Still, James trusted Ethan, even if part of him hesitated. Within moments, the climb turned treacherous. As they ascended, James felt the ground give way beneath him. He slipped, his foot catching on a loose rock, and with a sharp cry, he tumbled down the slope, crashing into the rocks below. The pain was immediate and intense. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and his vision blurred. Ethan's voice came from above, but it was distant, as though he were speaking through a fog. "James, are you all right?" I can't move," James gasped, panic setting in. Ethan rushed down the slope, his hands firm and calm as he assessed the injury. "It's bad, but we'll get you to safety," he said, his voice steady despite the situation. "Just breathe. I'm not going anywhere." But James's mind raced. The trust he had placed in Ethan was now in question. Why had they taken this route? Why hadn't Ethan warned him about the dangers? The nagging feeling he had felt earlier, the one telling him that something wasn't right, now screamed at him. Was this a test? Had Ethan planned this all along? As Ethan worked to stabilize his leg, James's mind whirled with confusion. He hadn't realized how deeply he had been questioning the relationship. In that moment, as Ethan pulled him up carefully and placed him over his shoulder to carry him to safety, the truth became clear. James's journey in the wilderness wasn't just about survival, it was about trust. And perhaps, just perhaps, this wasn't the guide's betrayal, but his own. The days that followed were a blur. James's leg was broken, but it was Ethan's resilience and unwavering support that helped him recover. During the long nights spent in the shelter Ethan had crafted, James learned more than just survival techniques. He learned humility, perseverance, and most importantly, the real value of strength, both physical and mental. As the time passed, the trust between them solidified. Ethan had not let him down. He had been the rock James never realized he needed. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting a dim orange glow across the treetops as James and Ethan sat by the fire. The crackling flames illuminated their tired faces. It had been nearly 2 weeks since James had broken his leg, and the wilderness had made its indelible mark on him. The pain of his injury had been replaced by something far more intense, the painful realization that he was no longer the same person who had set foot on these trails. He was raw, humbled, and for the first time, truly aware of his own vulnerability. For the first few days after the fall, James had fought the physical and emotional pain with a sense of entitlement. His frustration had manifested in anger, self-pity, and even suspicion of Ethan. He still couldn't shake the feeling that the guide had intentionally led them down that dangerous path to test him. The wild terrain had felt like a deliberate challenge, and James couldn't help but question Ethan's motives. But as the days went by, those questions began to fade into the background, overshadowed by the realization that Ethan had never once abandoned him. Instead, he had stayed focused, tending to James's injury, moving him to safer ground, and keeping the fire burning every night, even when James's hope had nearly flickered out. Yet tonight, something was different. The tension between them had built to an unbearable point. Ethan had been distant all day, barely speaking as he prepared their meager dinner. James had noticed his silence and wondered if something had changed between them, but what really unsettled him was the way Ethan kept glancing over at him as if weighing something. That night, as the fire died down to glowing embers, Ethan broke the silence. "You're ready, James," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. James looked up, confused. "Ready for what?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up, stretching his sore muscles before walking over to the edge of the camp, where a steep incline led down into the thick forest below. He turned back to James, his face shadowed by the flickering light of the fire. "The wilderness is more than just survival," Ethan continued, his voice thick with meaning. "It's about understanding who you are, what you're made of. You've been here long enough now, and I think you know it's not just about the hike. It's about what happens inside of you." James couldn't help but feel a wave of irritation. He was tired, exhausted physically, emotionally, and mentally, and he had no energy left for these cryptic speeches. "I don't know what you're talking about," James muttered, trying to suppress the frustration that bubbled up. "You've been taking me on this wild goose chase for weeks. This trip was supposed to teach me something, but it's been nothing but pain and exhaustion." Ethan's eyes darkened slightly, and for the first time, James saw a flicker of something deeper beneath the surface. Anger, perhaps, or disappointment. "You think this has been easy for me?" Ethan's voice was sharp now, cutting through the still night air. "You think I don't understand what it's like to be pushed to the edge? But unlike you, I didn't have a choice. I wasn't born with everything handed to me." The words hit James harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words died on his lips. He knew what Ethan was saying was true. He had spent his entire life surrounded by luxury, shielded from pain and hardship, never truly understanding the struggles of those who lived outside of the bubble he had been born into. Ethan had been molded by hardship, while James had been sheltered by privilege. But now, in the heart of the wilderness, it was clear their worlds could not have been more different. "Why are you doing this?" James finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why push me so hard?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before turning to face James fully, his gaze unwavering. "Because," he said, "you need to find your own strength. And that can't happen if I make everything easy for you." James looked at him, confused and angry, but Ethan's expression remained firm, unwavering in its intensity. "You came out here to get away from your father, right? To find something real. But the only way to do that is to face who you really are. Not the son of Richard Caldwell, not the heir to the empire, but James. Just James." James stared at him, his mind racing. He felt the weight of Ethan's words settle into his chest like a heavy stone. And suddenly, in that moment, everything clicked. This wasn't about the wilderness. It wasn't about the climb or the broken leg or even the survival tactics. It was about facing the man he had been and deciding who he wanted to become. Ethan had pushed him, not because he hated him, but because he knew that James had to face his fears, his doubts, and his arrogance in order to truly survive. The wilderness was a metaphor for life. You could keep running from the uncomfortable truths, or you could stand tall and face them. But as the realization settled in, a new wave of doubt surged within him. James still wasn't sure if he had the strength to fully embrace this change. He had spent his life avoiding challenges that didn't fit into his comfortable, predictable world. The wildness around him was alien, unpredictable, and dangerous, and it made him question his ability to face anything without the support he was used to. Ethan must have read the conflict in James's eyes, for he stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder, an act that conveyed both reassurance and finality. "It's time, James. I can't carry you anymore, but you can walk out of here under your own power. Trust yourself. Trust what you've learned." James looked at Ethan, then at the rugged path before him. The edge of the cliff loomed just ahead, where the trail they'd been following split. The way down was a steep, dangerous descent, one that would require every ounce of his focus, every bit of strength he had left. This was the moment. He had a choice: to back down, to call for help, to cling to the comfortable world he had left behind, or to face the challenge head-on, trusting his own capabilities. With a deep breath, James stood up. His body was aching, his mind was exhausted, but in his chest, a fire ignited. He could do this. It wasn't about the luxury he had grown up with or his father's expectations. It was about him, who he was now, not who he had been. The path before him wasn't going to be easy, but it was his to walk. Without another word, James took the first step toward the cliff's edge. His legs trembled, but he moved forward. And behind him, Ethan remained, silent, watching. It wasn't the wilderness that would break him. It was the choice to break free from everything that held him back. As he began to descend, James felt something within him shift. It wasn't fear anymore, or the doubt that had plagued him for so long. It was clarity. He wasn't lost anymore. He was finding himself. And for the first time in his life, he was finally ready to survive, not just as the heir to an empire, but as James Caldwell, the man who had learned to conquer the wilds of both nature and his own heart. Weeks later, James Caldwell emerged from the wilderness, battered but not broken. His once pristine clothes were now worn and weathered, much like his body. His leg had healed, but the real transformation had happened in his mind and soul. He had learned to survive, not just in the physical sense, but in the emotional and psychological realms as well. James had made his way down that treacherous path, taking every step with deliberation, trust in his instincts, and belief in himself. The journey had been difficult, and there were moments when he wanted to give up, but as each day passed, he shed pieces of his former self, the entitled, complacent son of a billionaire, and found a strength within that he never knew existed. When he finally returned to civilization, the world he once knew felt foreign. He was no longer the man who expected the world to bend to his will. He had seen the rawness of nature, the harshness of survival, and the fragility of life. He had learned to listen to his own inner voice, instead of constantly seeking validation from the world around him. Ethan had remained a quiet presence during their final moments in the wilderness, offering no praise, no accolades. It was as if Ethan knew that James's victory over himself was the only acknowledgement that truly mattered. Ethan had pushed him, but never with cruelty, only with the belief that James was capable of more than he thought. In the end, it was not the wilderness that tested James, but his own inner conflicts. The wilderness was just the stage. The real challenge was inside him all along. James returned to his father's estate with a new perspective. His father, Richard, was waiting for him, expecting the same arrogant, spoiled son who had left weeks earlier. But when James entered the mansion, it was with a quiet strength. He didn't need to boast about what he had accomplished or try to explain his journey. His eyes, his posture, the way he spoke, everything had changed. He had discovered a truth about himself that no amount of money or influence could provide. And, despite all the wealth and success Richard had accumulated, James realized that there was one thing his father could never give him: true self-understanding. Richard noticed the change immediately. His usual sharpness softened just a fraction when he saw the transformation in his son. For the first time, James didn't feel the need to explain himself or gain approval. He was not defined by his last name or his father's legacy. He was his own person, someone who had faced the wilderness, both literal and figurative, and come out the other side stronger. In the weeks that followed, James's actions spoke louder than words ever could. He took a more active role in the family business, but this time it wasn't because of his father's expectations. It was because he wanted to contribute in a meaningful way, using the lessons he had learned. He started working on initiatives to give back to the communities that had been left behind by the tech empire his father had built. He realized that true success wasn't measured by profit margins or market share, but by the difference you made in the lives of others. As for Ethan, James never saw him again. Ethan had never wanted any accolades or recognition. His role had been to guide James to the discovery of his own strength. James thought often of their time together, and he would occasionally make small donations to causes that aligned with Ethan's values. It was his quiet way of honoring the man who had helped him discover who he truly was. The moral of James's journey is simple, yet profound. Survival isn't just about overcoming physical challenges. It's about confronting your fears, shedding the layers of comfort that shield you from the world, and discovering the strength within. The wilderness may be unforgiving, but it is also a great teacher. In nature's harshest moments, James learned that the greatest battles we face are not with the world around us, but with the limitations we place on ourselves.